All right, well, hello everyone. Let's pick up and talk a little bit about conformity, obedience, and moral disengagement. One of the big questions that social psychology has tried to answer is this one. Why do good people do bad things? Now, this is the most commonly sought out question, particularly in the areas of conformity, obedience, and moral disengagement. Now, what we do know is there are both individual as well as group processes that may explain why people act in ways that are really contrary to their own beliefs. Now, when we talk about moral disengagement, we're talking about the process by which individuals rationalize engaging in immoral behavior. There's some other important terms too. There's another term that's helpful to know, which is entrapment. And so entrapment is a gradual process in which individuals escalate their commitment to a course of action to justify their investment of time, money, or effort. And a big concept that we will look at in this chapter is social learning. And social learning is a theory that emphasizes how behavior is learned and maintained through observation and imitation of others. And social learning theory was the brainchild of Albert Bandura, who's a Canadian. He actually just recently passed away. And he had created this famous Bobo doll study. And this is an actual picture of the actual Bobo doll that was involved in his studies, and that I got to see when I went to a psychology museum, because yes, I am that nerdy. Now, when we look at group processes for moral disengagement, there are four that are important to be aware of, and that's conformity, groupthink, diffusion of responsibility, and de-individuation. So when we talk about conformity, that refers to the tendency to act and to think like the people around us. Now, humans may possess an inherent tendency to imitate other people. And although we're not usually aware of it, we often mimic the gestures, body posture, language, talking speed, and many other behaviors of the people we interact with. And the more that we mimic, the more we actually increase connection between ourselves and other people, and it allows our interactions to flow more smoothly. But beyond this automatic tendency, there are two reasons for conformity. One of them is that people go along with the crowd because they're concerned of what other people will think of them. So we call that normative influence. And this was really studied well by Solomon Asch. And he really looked at this idea of normative influence amongst male college students. So the way that the study was set up is that participants would have to say out loud which of the three lines on the right was the same length as the line on the left. And there were about 6 other people in the room, and they were what we call confederates. And confederates are people who are in on the research study. They know what's actually being studied. And so you go into this group, but you don't know that these other people are actually part of the research study. And so they've been told to act in particular ways and do certain things, and you're not aware of that. So in this particular study, there'd be 6 other people in the room. They would also give their answers to this line judgment task. But one of the things was that they would give an incorrect answer. And then what Solomon Asch was really interested in was to measure to see how you would respond. So for example, there's 3 lines on the left, and so maybe they would all say that, B is the exact same length as the line on the left. Well, you and I are looking at that, and we're probably like, that looks more like C would be the one, right? But what the study found is that about 76% of participants would go along with the norm at least once and also give the wrong answers. When they asked participants after the fact, they said that they knew that they were giving an incorrect answer, but they were really worried what these other people might be thinking about them, and that overpowered their desire to do the right thing. And so Asch studied this in a whole bunch of different conditions with elevators and all kinds of things to see if people would go along with what others were doing in a particular setting. And so Asch really solidified this idea that normative influence is very, very important to us as social beings. Now, this kind of led to some other studies surrounding conformity, and so these findings are very easily replicated. We find, for example, that teenagers are more prone to conforming than adults. People conform significantly less often when they believe the Confederates will not hear their responses. And we tend to find that in collectivist, as opposed to individualistic countries, that conformity is a much more common practice. And the theory behind that is that collectivist cultures place a higher value on the goals of the group. And so therefore, there's a stronger motivation to maintain harmony in interpersonal relationships. So normative influence is one of the influences on us for conformity. The other one is what we call informational influence. So sometimes another reason that we go along with the crowd is that people are often a source of information for us. So for example, in order to get people to behave a bit better or behave in a more environmentally friendly way, using these little towel hangers to say what other people are doing, has actually increased the number of people who will reuse their towels instead of just throwing it into the tub and getting a new towel every single day. So we are influenced by the source of informations that we are around. However, when it's not clear what society expects of us, we rely on what we call descriptive norms, and we act the way that most people, or most people like us, act. So sometimes we rely on a flawed notion of the norm when deciding how we should behave. Now, without kind of belaboring this point, because I probably come back to this every single lecture, but during this particular time of vaccination, this is a very important kind of thing. So if our societal norms aren't telling us how what we should do about this, we tend to look and do what the people around us are doing, and we tend to behave in a way that is congruent with the people that we are closest to. Now, the problem with descriptive norm information is that we can actually have really misperceived what is actually normal. And so, for example, research for binge drinking among college students has found that students binge drink because they believe that most other people their age are also binge drinking. So they notice, for example, the one heavy drinker at the party, but they fail to consider all the students who are not attending the party. This is very similar to that whole idea of survivorship bias, right? Paying attention to the successes versus the failures. In this particular case, we're paying attention to one descriptor and saying that's the norm versus not looking at all of the other factors that could determine what really is the actual norm. So students often overestimate these descriptive norms. So providing students with accurate information about drinking norms can actually reduce overindulgent drinking, and that's been a very important intervention on many college campuses. Now, sometimes we're directed by a more powerful person to do things that we may not want to do. And so this is the whole idea of obedience. And obedience is looking at the field of looking at how people react when given an order or a command from someone in a position of authority. In most situations, obedience is a very good thing, but there is also a dark side to obedience. So obedience is often at the heart of some of the worst of human behavior: massacres, atrocities, and even genocide. Now, Stanley Milgram in the 1960s wanted to know why so many German citizens went along with the brutality of the Nazi leaders during the Holocaust. And he wrote in 1963, "These inhumane policies may have originated in the mind of a single person, but they could only be carried out on a massive scale if a very large number of persons obeyed orders." Now, there's a short video for you to watch that kind of shows you the overview of Milgram's obedience study, but I'm going to spend a little bit of additional time on it because I think for a couple reasons that this is such an important study. For one, I think if we're looking at the field of obedience, it is the study that is important for us to discuss. The other reason why is because of the ethics surrounding this study and the continued controversy, even to this day, regarding whether or not this was ethical or unethical and what we should do with the information that we found. Now, like I said before, a confederate is an aide to an experimenter who poses as a participant but whose behavior is rehearsed prior to the experiment. So both Solomon Asch as well as Stanley Milgram relied on the use of confederates for their studies. Now, Milgram initially believed that in his particular video, or his particular study, that only 0.1% of all of his subjects would go and obey all the way to the end of his study. But in reality, what we ended up finding was there were about 65% of people administered the highest level of shock. Now, you're maybe wondering kind of what I'm kind of getting at, and I'll explain this study in a brief moment. But when Milgram, before he did his study, he asked a whole bunch of psychiatrists and other researchers what they thought, how far people would go with obeying his study. And that's where this 0.1% comes from. But in reality, the finding was very, very different. So let's talk a little bit about it. So the Milgram study was set up like this, that you have the T, which is the teacher, and this was the person who was a Confederate. right? And then they were supposed to administer a painful electric shock to the learner, L. Now, what the teacher didn't know is that they weren't actually giving an electric shock at all. It was just set up to look like an electric, as if they were giving an electric shock, but they actually did not give an electric shock. However, the learner, who was the Confederate on the other end of this kind of mirror, this one-way mirror, they would scream when they would get these shocks. And so the teacher actually believed that they were giving electric shocks to the learner. Now, the E over there, this is the examiner, and so this would be Milgram or whoever sitting in there and telling the person, the teacher, that they had to continue with the experiment regardless of what was happening to the learner. Now, the learner would also then go and he would say things like, oh, I've got a bad heart. Oh, you're hurting me. Oh, stop it. Please, no. And so there would be a lot of psychological distress that was created for the teacher. And so Milgram would get them to go and to administer the shocks, starting all the way from the bottom. And you can see there were labels on there: strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intense shock, all the way to severe. And then I think the final settings was like XXX, as in like death. And so you're supposed to continue up the way, increase the level of shock for every kind of list of words that they got wrong, because there was a word learning task. Now, the whole purpose of the study was to see how far the teacher would go before refusing to continue. While the learner did not receive any actual shocks, their reactions became stronger and louder with each lever press. The experimenter's role was to encourage the participant to continue. If at any time the teacher asked to end, the experimenter responded with, "The experiment requires that you continue." So the experimenter ended the session only after the teacher stated 4 successive times that he did not want to continue. So there was a heavy amount of pressure to continue in this particular experiment. Now, the big question that we need to ask, though, is under which conditions would people disobey, right? So we know that 65% of people would continue to go all the way up, right? But Milgram and his Confederates also kind of played around with seeing under which conditions would people refuse to obey. And so they found that there were a couple important things. So one, they found that if the experimenter left the room, the teacher was more likely to disobey and would stop giving the shocks. They also found that when the learner was in the same room as the teacher, the teacher was less likely to continue the experiment because they could see the distress much more clearly, and there's that proximity to the person whom they believe that they're hurting. People would also disobey if 2 experimenters issued conflicting demands. So if one said keep going and the other said, oh no, you can stop, then they would just stop. And they found that when the person giving orders was an ordinary person, then people were more likely to disobey. So the experimenter would wear a white lab coat and look very official, and so they found that that was served as a cue that this was a person of authority telling you that you had to continue. They also found that when the teacher worked with peers who refused to go on, that the teacher would stop administering the shocks as well. Now, we found as well, or not we, but Milgram found that there were certain conditions under which people would obey more. And so they found that the closer that the experimenter stood to the teacher, even if the learner was in the same room, that would serve as a persuading force for the teacher to continue the experiment. They found that the more official the experimenter looked, the more people would continue to obey. So those are 2 conditions under which obedience would increase more. So the question then that we have to be left with at the end is, was the study so bad? And I'm going to post a couple excerpts for you about the ethics of this study. And I really want to encourage you to read this, because I think this is really the question. This is one of those times where we look at it and say, like, wow, there were definitely benefits, but there were also risks. And the big question that we're left with asking ourselves at the end of the day is, do the risks outweigh the benefits? Is there any other way that we could have gotten this information? Does this research meet the standards of, respect for the dignity of people? Does this research, was it necessary, I guess, in order for us to really understand that good people can do bad things? So, like I said, those are kind of the 2 big questions. Was it ethical and was it necessary? Now, some of the cons that are important for you to be aware of about Milgram's study is that participants were kept in the dark about the study's purpose. So this kind of violates these concepts of deception as well as informed consent. Many participants also suffered emotional pain. So we're looking at something then that's impacting the welfare of participants. Some would argue that the suffering outweighed the benefits of the study, and so that's that whole principle of cost benefit. And then there's also questions regarding comparing the study participants' willingness to obey to that of Nazis. So does the study have actual ecological validity? And one of the big arguments, and especially this was made by Diana Baumrind, was that this study was damaging to the discipline of psychology because of how poorly subjects were treated. Another very important thing is that did participants really have the right to withdraw? If the experimenter would not stop the experiment until the teacher had said 4 times that they no longer wanted to continue, did the participants really have a meaningful right to withdraw from a study, as they should and as is normal within other studies? Now, at the same time, there are also some pros to keep in mind, and this is a balancing act, right? So the reality is that few subjects reported lasting harm. The outcomes of the study were also extremely unexpected, and Milgram really argued hard for this, saying, well, the psychiatrists and other researchers he asked had said 0.1% of people would follow through. He wasn't expecting that 65% of people would follow through all the way to the end. Another thing that was actually very unique about Milgram's study is that participants were debriefed following the study. That was at that time not a requirement for research ethics, and yet it was something that he included. And they were also given psychiatric follow-up 1 year later to kind of look at and ensure their well-being. Many participants, about 84%, indicated that they learned something of value from participating in the study, despite the fact that it had caused them distress. So there's this idea of beneficence. And Milgram argued very hard that we must respect each individual's right to make choices. And so if we determine what's in a person's best interest without allowing them to make the choices of that, are we truly allowing them to, and are we respecting their personhood? So what's the verdict? Well, one of the things that Milgram said that's important for us to know is that the disappearance of a sense of responsibility is the utmost far-reaching consequence